Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Eric Turing. I'm the Senior Vice President for the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar today. This webinar is sponsored by the ACVPM and our partner organizations, the National Association of Federal Veterinarians and the American Association of Food Safety and Public Health Veterinarians. We've got a fantastic speaker today, Dr. Dustin Weaver, who currently serves as a Deputy State Veterinarian at the Georgia Department of Agriculture. Dr. Weaver joined the Georgia Department of Agriculture Meat Inspection Section in 2018 before transitioning to the Division of Animal Health. Prior to his work in Georgia, Dr. Weaver worked in rural mixed animal practice and commercial cattle practice for 8 years in Colorado. He earned his bachelor's degree in environmental health and his veterinary degree from Colorado State University. He possesses a master's degree in public health from the University of Colorado. Dr. Weaver is passionate about preventive medicine and was accepted into the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine in 2018. He is a proud member of the Georgia Cattlemen's Association and raises a small herd of Angus cattle in Morgan County, Georgia. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dustin Weaver.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And let me turn on my video here. Good evening, everyone from Georgia. Yeah, so good evening, and thank you for spending some time with me tonight as we discuss feral swine. I've been looking forward to this presentation and should hopefully have some time to entertain questions at the end, if we have any. I'm originally from Colorado, and in coming to Georgia, realized that when Charlie Daniels sang his song about the devil coming to Georgia, he was really singing about feral swine. As you'll see from the presentation, it's that song rings true there, or that sound. So anyway, without any further ado, we'll get going on this. So to talk about feral swine, we first need to talk about where they come from. What is a wild pig as we know it in the United States? We need to go back to the Eurasian wild boar, which is native to Eastern Europe, Asia, and Russia. Also known as the Russian wild boar, was domesticated over 9,000 years ago through selective breeding for size, muscle, and reproductive performance, was changed into the modern day domestic pig as we know it, like this Yorkshire white pig pictured here on the left, or the many other domestic breeds that we have today. So you cross those two and you get this guy here at the bottom. It's kind of reverted back to that Eurasian wild boar, but really, as far as genomically, it's the same. In Georgia, we have a saying that a pig is a pig is a pig. Now, I'm recognizing that the United States, with this invasive feral pig, can successfully reproduce with our domestic varieties and is sometimes only a few generations out of the barnyard. The feral pig adapts to the wild. They will often revert to characteristics of the wild boar. So they'll get some longer hair. They'll raise their shoulders up, get a longer snout, and the piglets will have stripes on them. They'll get ears that go erect and a tail that stays straight. But one thing that they do still continue to do very well is breed. So what are their origins in the United States? They come over early in the, late 1800s, early 1900s. Folks brought the Eurasian wild boar over for hunting purposes, believe it or not. And as you'll see, that's kind of ironic with the problem that we have today. But so you have over on the left side of this slide here, a series of dates showing different documented entries of the Eurasian wild boar across the Atlantic Ocean and into the New World. And then on the right-hand side with this domestic pig, it was brought over in 1539 to the United States. And in a story that we'll talk about on the next slide, escaped and became feral and returned to the wild. And also through time, the domestic pigs here in the US have escaped and gone feral. And the feral pigs that have escaped have hybridized or had a hybridization with the Eurasian wild boar that was here wandering around in the woods. And that's how we get the modern day common wild pig. So back to 1539. In 1538, this guy named Hernando de Soto left Spain And he landed in Tampa Bay on May 25th, 1539, with 10 ships, 700 men, and a herd of hogs. He explored the southeastern United States, starting with Florida, and then went through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. He documented everywhere he went, and along his way, left pigs. So that's how the domestic pigs at first became feral and started wandering around the swamps and the woods of the southeastern United States. In May 1542, he died of either yellow fever or malaria, but he left a legacy. So fast forward 500 years, DeSoto left the hogs. And from the 1700s to 1900s, free-ranging pigs roamed the swamps and mountains of the southeastern U.S. And until relatively recently, and this is in kind of small print, you can't maybe read it, but there weren't fences, there weren't fence laws. So these pigs roamed, and farmers marked their ears to know what was theirs and what was wild or what was somebody else's. And that just perpetuated and grew the problem. In 1930s, there was something called the Great Depression. Again, that perpetuated the problem because farms were abandoned and pigs were released. In the Historical Society, the Piney Woods Rooter wrote an article in the 30s and showed this picture of a feral hog. And they said in that article that above is a feral hog, and their kind has been roaming Effingham County and been a nuisance for generations. So not only were they there and present in the 30s, but they had already been a nuisance for generations. So this is not a new problem. It is a growing problem, but DeSoto left the hogs. They were left to free range, and that plus time has equaled our current pig population problem. So let's talk about their reproduction. As you may remember from veterinary school, pigs are 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, or 115 days. So potentially, a sow could have 3 litters a year, but realistically, it amounts to 2 in the wild. So in the wild, a sow can have 4 to 5, maybe 6 piglets that survive. So let's say that in a given year, a sow has 10 piglets and 5 of them are gilts. If you do the math and add it up, one sow can reproduce and to a point where she's making 60 pigs a year, which is tremendous. The highest reproductive rate of any ungulates. So you can see the other comparative gestations in different species and how amazing pigs are at reproducing. Today we have about 7 million, and this is a very rough estimate, but about 7 million pigs from surveys that have been done in the wild in the US. In Georgia specifically, we're thought to have about 1/6 of that. There's been some trials that UGA has done, and Dr. Minchek from the University of Georgia did these trials, and in the trials they tagged adult females and young piglets. This specific trial, 71 piglets were captured and tagged, and they monitored them over time through several months and found that 60 out of the 71 survived, which is a tremendous survival. So these little boogers, especially in the southeastern United States, can survive, 95% survival. So this is a slide talking about what we do or what the plan is from the USDA's perspective to manage feral swine. The primary goal is to minimize the damage caused by swine, to protect agriculture, livestock, natural resources, property, human health, and safety. We accomplish that by simply suppressing populations in areas where feral populations are high and widely distributed. And this is probably the only time you'll hear me mention this, but eliminating specific populations of feral swine in states where the population is low or newly emerging. You may have seen this from the USDA's website, but the purple county level boxes here represent areas where in 2019, the feral swine have been located. So you can see they fill up a large geographic area of the United States. And just for comparison, looking at 1982 map, you can see how quickly they are spreading. What was, many counties in northern Georgia that weren't in, are now filled in. Texas even wasn't fully filled in, and now it's all the way full. They're expanding north, and they're doing it pretty rapidly. And we'll get into more detail about why we think it's happening so rapidly. So what about Canada, eh? For some time, there was a commonly held belief that feral swine could not tolerate cold climates of our northern states. However, in the early 90s, we began to see that feral swine had established themselves in Canada, which shouldn't really surprise us given the origin of the wild pig and that it comes from some very cold areas of Eastern Europe and Russia. He found this research done in Canada was done by Dr. Booker, and he showed that these sounders of pigs, which is sounder is a grouping of pigs, can root underneath the snow and kind of create snow caves and survive in some pretty cold environments. I mean, it gets down to negative 50 degrees in some of these areas in Saskatchewan. So Dr. Ryan Booker recently presented at the Swine Health Improvement Plan meeting in Minneapolis recently and shared these data from Canada. Each red dot represents a location within the provinces where pigs have been identified, expanding over 300,000 square miles with over 60,000 unique occurrences of wild pigs. Predominantly in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, but the populations are scattered also in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. As you can see, many of the red dots are near the national border with the United States, and pigs don't adhere to national passport rules or import or export rules. They'll just likely cross the border, and they do so with ease. So it's safe to assume, even though they're not on the last map, that we do have some pigs in our northern states. How are they getting there? Back to that, how fast are they spreading? They're spreading at 65 miles an hour down the highway. Hunting feral swine has become a fun cultural event. You can see beer and kids and dogs and pigs all together. Much like the original Eurasian boar hunts of the 1900s, unfortunately, it continues to spread the feral swine problem, and this happens when there's a huge financial incentive for folks to relocate the pigs for hunting. So they move at 65 miles an hour down the road, which is illegal in the state of Georgia, but nonetheless, it happens. So what about survival? Coming back to that, the pig is an opportunistic omnivore. It eats anything. It eats crops, mast, which is like berries and acorns, grasses and forbs, roots, bulbs, tubers. It eats mushrooms, invertebrates. And if that's not good enough, they'll eat amphibians and reptiles. They eat mammals. They eat birds and nests and eggs. They eat garbage and animal food. They eat just about anything. 85% of their diet is vegetable matter. Here's a hunting camera with a picture of deer food over on the right. They like the deer food and the deer corn, but shoot, they'll also eat the deer. Here's a picture of them eating a carcass. This is a picture of a row crop here in Georgia. Better than a GPS, this group of pigs followed the planted seeds that this farmer put down, and they just went in a straight line and ate through the crop. So in 2002, in Georgia, 31% of county extension agents had 163 complaints about wild pigs. That has dramatically increased, and now 71% of county extension agents are reporting 758 complaints about wild pigs. It's 365% increase in that time frame. And this isn't just rural counties. This is everywhere, urban, suburban, you name it. As far as direct economic costs, this is a large direct cost. So we are talking to the tune of $1.5 billion a year, but realistically, it's much larger, probably more like $2 billion a year. California, the authors said that the figures for damage were severely underestimated. In Texas, $7 million was used in the control effort. So that wasn't included In North Carolina, pigs were the third most frequently reported problem species for human-animal conflict. In Alabama, $645,000 of damage was just done to roads. In Florida, 9 counties in northern Florida had 87,000 hectares of damage. That's 215,000 acres. And then we get to Georgia in 2011, there was $37 million in direct damages. That number increased in 2014 to $83 million in direct damages. If you add in other than crop damages, add $31 million to that for a total exceeding the $114 million. But then there's those things that we can't measure, right? And how do you put a value on them? So at the last bullet point here, I just mentioned what is the value of a nest of green sea turtle eggs? There's an endangered species, and we have them on the barrier islands in Georgia. And right now, as we speak, there's DNR employees there looking over the nest, protecting the sea turtle nest from predation from feral swine, invasive feral swine. So I don't know that you can put a value on that, but I sure want my kids to enjoy that and their kids after them, getting to see sea turtles. So we know that each year farmers replant their crops, often more than once. And as a result of feral swine, urban and suburban environments are invaded too. They destroy golf courses and cemeteries, parks, gardens, yards, pastures, and other cultivated areas. They threaten animals and humans with our health. Here's a picture. It looks like the aliens landed in South Georgia, but that's feral swine. This is a golf course not too far from my house, Hard Labor Creek Golf Course, where feral swine have rooted through looks like the green. And here's a picture of feral swine out amongst the ecosystem, peeing and pooping in the water. They carry leptospirosis and other diseases. So this is just a reminder that they're out there spreading disease too. Here's somebody's front yard. And if your front yard isn't bad enough, what about where your grandma's buried? So now we're going to kind of transition from the direct damages that feral swine cause from their expansion and overpopulation problems to disease. Feral swine carry many diseases. And so I think it's safe to assume, and it needs to be assumed, that all feral swine are infected with something. We're all aware in this group here that zoonotic diseases are those diseases that pass from animals to humans. And feral swine have many of those. Specifically, the marketplace depends on domestic swine herd that's free of brucellosis and pseudorabies. And that's been very documented that feral swine threaten this classification status and thus the market for all swine. And not only just diseases like pseudorabies and brucellosis, but what about foreign animal diseases? We're going to spend some considerable amount of time on African swine fever tonight. And so I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. So here's a list of feral swine diseases. And it's not an all-inclusive list, but it's got some big ones here. Common diseases that you would expect to see in commercial production, like or transitional production, like PRRS and PED, influenza. A pig is a pig is a pig. They can carry all the same stuff. But they also present a problem for foreign animal diseases like ASF, FMD. What about the other diseases that look like FMD, like Seneca virus A? They can carry all of these things. So now we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about African swine fever virus. I would be remiss if we didn't, because it's such a hot topic right now. And so we're going to dive in a little bit deeper here. I'm going to share some material from the Center for Food Safety and Public Health from Iowa State. So ASF is caused by a large DNA virus. It's a virus unique, and it's the sole member of its genus. It's the only known arthropod-borne DNA virus, and there's more than 20 genotypes. ASF has isolates vary greatly in their virulence depending on genotype, and they can cause up to 100% mortality, while lower virulent isolates may lead only to seroconversion, and especially in our more sturdy feral populations. All genotypes are present in Africa. Well, right now, only genotypes 1 and 2 are elsewhere around the world. ASF is primarily a virus of mononuclear cells, so monocytes, macrophages. The virus also has a predilection for lymph nodes near the head. On this last bullet point here, 8 distinct serotypes, that as well as the fact that it's within white blood cells, it presents real challenges for developing a vaccine. And right now there isn't a vaccine that can be used for ASF. So here's a map showing the 2016 to 2020 distribution. This map is from the WOA or the OIE. You can see that in Africa, where the virus started, it's still there and doing well there. But it went into Russia and then spread west, into Europe. And then after that, east into China. And it's when it got to China that alarm bells started going off here in the United States, looking at risk models. The risk of it getting into the United States once it got to China jumped by like 200, they presented this at the SHIP meeting as well, but the swine health improvement meeting, but I think it went up by 180 to almost 200%, the risk of getting ASF in the US. Here's another picture from WOA showing the map of Hispaniola. And recently here, or relatively recently, the virus made its way onto the island, and infections have been widespread throughout the island, both in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti, which, with the political turmoil, not to mention the weather, there are big challenges in controlling the disease on that island. But each circle on this map represents herds that have been depopulated in the various provinces in the 2 countries on the island. And the USDA has been doing a marvelous job controlling the disease there, and has been working as best they can with the governments there to help both in surveillance efforts and disease control efforts. Another thing to look at here is the location of Puerto Rico. This is a U.S. territory, and it sits awfully close to the island of Hispaniola. The risk of it getting onto Puerto Rico is huge, and the consequences for trade getting onto a U.S. territory are large. So for the first time ever, the USDA established what is called a zone of protection. Through increased surveillance efforts, they have tried to demonstrate to our trading partners throughout the world that we'll know if it's on Puerto Rico. And if we know it's on Puerto Rico, we'll also know if it's on the mainland of the U.S. In support of that, this is just a snip capture from the dashboard of the USDA ASF CSF page, highlighting the increased level of sampling that has taken place from 2019 to 2022, with the third quarter of 2022 showing an increase in foreign animal disease investigations and sampling for ASF. Since the second half of 2019, over 31,000 ASF samples have been obtained to support the claims of disease freedom here in the United States. So I would encourage you all to, after this presentation, to jump onto the dashboard and look at the information that they have on their sampling efforts, because they're doing a great job. So ASF is a highly resistant virus in the environment, which is unique because it's enveloped, but it's especially at low temperatures, it can survive in proteinaceous environments such as uncooked pork products. The virus can remain viable for long periods in blood, feces, and tissues. It can survive days in feces. It can survive 150 days in salted dried ham. And so this makes it important at our ports for Customs and Border Control to monitor the food that's coming in through the airports, through boats, and monitoring for illegal boat traffic, which they're doing on Puerto Rico as well. Looking at virus introduction outbreaks, uncooked, undercooked pork products fed to pigs is the biggest risk that's been identified. In some states in the United States, garbage feeding is still legal, but it has restrictions. For example, in Florida, garbage feeding is legal, but they need to cook their garbage, and the facilities need to be licensed. In Georgia, the feeding of swill feeding or garbage feeding, but that's not to say it doesn't happen, under the radar. And so it becomes important to really look out and get the message out that we shouldn't be feeding, especially pork products to pigs. Raw pork, waste, garbage at any airport or shipping ports are important. Feral swine are everywhere. They get around, they get through fences. They can certainly make their way into pork garbage before it's destroyed. And so that's something that's important and Wildlife Services is monitoring for. Another big factor here to consider is the movement and the range, especially of the male boar in the wild population of pigs. It's miles, it's over 10 miles that these guys travel around. And so if they happen to be infected, they can easily spread it amongst the female pigs throughout the sounders that they breed. The impact of African swine fever can have serious health consequences for pigs directly, but it also has economic and international trade consequences. ASF, it has a high morbidity and mortality. It's called the Ebola of swine. The disease is a threat to global food security, and it's listed as a notifiable disease with the WOA as well as the USDA, and it's known as a high consequence foreign animal disease. It's one of the reasons why we're here talking tonight. Confirmed cases may lead to a ban on import and export of pigs and pork products from different countries. And, just as a bullet here, I put that in the 2021 export of pork alone was $8.1 billion. And if that was eliminated, it doesn't take long for the population of pigs to dramatically increase and the price of pork to drop within our domestic supply, putting farmers out of work. The epidemic would get prolonged, if not become an endemic situation, if feral swine are involved. In domesticated pigs, like we mentioned before, morbidity is high, approaching 100%. Mortality is really variable, but expected to be high in a naive population originally when the first incursion happens. All ages are affected, and subacute mortality does occur. So we're going to go into some more of the clinical signs, both antemortem and postmortem signs, and transmission. Transmission of ASF can occur by direct and indirect contact with infected animals, with their body fluids or tissues. The virus is widespread throughout the pig. They're just full of virus. And so whether it's saliva, ocular secretions, nasal discharge, or other, the virus is expected to be there. ASF can be found in all tissues and fluids with particularly high levels in blood. And so, carcasses of dead pigs and cannibalism of dead pigs becomes a problem. Fomites, veterinary vehicles, clothing, equipment, they can all transmit the disease. Environmental contamination with the bodily fluids also plays a role. Bites from infected ticks may spread the virus as well. And this will be explained further in the next slide. Mechanical transmission has been documented with Stomoxys flies to domestic pigs experimentally, but hasn't really been shown in the real world. The big vector in Africa is the Ornithodoros tick. It's two real species of tick that within the Ornithodoros genus that are implicated, which is Eradicus and porcinus. Individual ticks can remain infected for 3 years or more, and the infected soft tick colonies can maintain the virus for years. So ASF can spread through some tick species transstadially, transovarially, and sexually. And individual ticks can remain infected for life, and the infected soft tick colonies, like I said previously, remain viable for years. In some regions of Africa, ASF is thought to be more of a tick disease than it is a pig disease, and pigs are sometimes just thought of more of the accidental host. We do have of the 5 species of Ornithodoros ticks, we have 4 of them in Central and North America. So there is the possibility that this soft tick could play a role here. I will say, though, that in Europe and in the other places where it's occurring now, they haven't really shown that to be true. It's mostly been through wild pig issues and through direct contact with pig to pig. Looking at the clinical disease of ASF, the incubation period is 5 to 21 days following the direct contact. But if there's a tick bite, it can be less than 5 days. African swine fever can take a peracute, acute, subacute, or chronic form. Some of the animals can seroconvert even without developing clinical signs as they're starting to see in Europe and other places. This is what it looks like. This pig is probably post-mortem, but antemortem, you may see big blotches of erythema and cyanosis in the ears, high fever and recumbency, weakness, and lethargy. That's what you'll see in the acute disease. Acute disease post-mortem lesions are not quite as impressive, but the chronic disease is more impressive post-mortem. Here's a picture of two sows with ASF, and you can see this kind of blood stain on the white walls behind the two sows. They just had this hemorrhagic bloody diarrhea from the ASF infection. They feel terrible. They have fevers. They're lying on the floor. Shortly after the picture here, they were euthanized. Back to the acute disease here. Diarrhea is one of the symptoms, hemorrhagic diarrhea. Abortion is one of the earlier signs, and usually that's more of a quick thing that goes along with the spike in fever. Respiratory signs include dyspnea and nasal discharge, and death is usually around a week. I just want to check in here and make sure that everybody can hear me and see the slides all right, and make sure that there aren't any issues or burning questions at this point.
We can hear you, Dr. Weaver. I will ask one question that came up, just because you're still talking about African swine fever. You mentioned that there is no effective vaccine. Do you have any updates on any progress towards getting an effective vaccine?
I know that the USDA at Plum Island specifically has been working diligently on that. They've published some articles with promise. So I don't know how fast it's going to be until it gets out, but yeah, they're working hard at it. And so I'd encourage you to look at the literature and see what they got going on, because they got some exciting things happening.
Great. Other questions that have come in, we'll wait till the end, but we can hear you, see you fine. Captivating presentation.
Good. All right. So moving on, post-mortem lesions. You can see here on the surface of the heart that there's hemorrhage. On the internal organs, there's discoloration and hemorrhage. Signs of bloody diarrhea when you open up the intestines, and internal hemorrhage. This next picture is going to show the enlarged spleen, which is one of those characteristics of ASF things to look for. Is this just grossly enlarged and friable, dark spleen? Then other post-mortem lesions to look for would be the lymph nodes. So swollen hemorrhagic lymph nodes as pictured here. This is the gastrohepatic lymph nodes. Renal lymph nodes common as well. They're just dark and full of blood. Something that I didn't mention in the last slide, but that is good to look for, are the tonsils, because they get large and hemorrhagic too. Kidneys can show a lot of petechiations, both on the cut surface and at the cortical level. And there's often perirenal edema. You saw a couple slides back to the, and I didn't mention it, but the pericardial fluid that had accumulated around the heart. And so that's ASF. I'm going to move on to brucellosis now, just because ASF is not the only thing that feral pigs can spread around, unfortunately. But brucellosis is a problem too. And it's a problem that we have in the current populations of feral swine versus one that isn't here yet. So there are several varieties of brucellosis. The one that we're probably all most familiar with is Brucella abortus, historically in the United States with cattle, but also bison and buffalo. The form of brucellosis that the swine get is brucellosis suis, or Brucella suis, and then of course sheep and goats get the Brucella melitensis. There's different serovarieties of brucellosis as well, but all of them can go to people, and it causes a significant and debilitating disease in people. In pigs, brucellosis causes abortions, infertility, orchitis, epididymitis, and swollen joints. We've seen it here in Georgia, both in captive feral swine and in, unfortunately, in some transitional populations of domestic pigs. In humans, we can get it through exposure to the infected animal, and B. suis is implicated in the majority of brucellosis infections reported in Georgia. Feral swine are the most important source of that. So a USDA Wildlife Services survey showed that 30% of feral swine are B. suis positive, which is a big number, and 32% have pseudorabies. So hunters can be exposed most commonly during field dressing, and the bacteria can enter through skin wounds. Bacteria can be inhaled as well during field dressing. So butchering and the handling of the raw product in the kitchen can even be a risk when you take the meat home for your family. Signs and symptoms and treatment of brucellosis. This is information from the Department of Public Health, the Georgia Department of Public Health. So it, just like Brucella abortus was called undulating fever, Brucella suis can cause an undulating fever and chills and sweating, comes and goes, and often it's lifelong. I mean, this is a hard one to get rid of. It will cause fatigue and muscle pain and joint pain. Joints will get so swollen that they'll sometimes burst open, or leaks joint fluid just right out of the joint. You'll get abscesses in the vertebral column. Dr. Cobb, who is a former state veterinarian here in Georgia, wouldn't mind me sharing this. He shared it when he gave this presentation, but he had Brucella. He had Brucella abortus, but he just described it as being a terrible, terrible thing that nobody wants. He brought it to presentations because he wanted the personal experience with the disease to be communicated to people, just to stress the importance of using barrier precautions when hunting, because it's a common thing to hunt feral swine, at least in the South and pretty much anywhere now. So symptoms develop within a week to a month after contact with an infected animal. Hunters are the biggest risk factor here, and treatment course, if you're able to clear it, is a 6-week treatment of antibiotics. The illness, if not treated, or even if treated, people still often will develop serious chronic problems like arthritis in their joints. So how do we diagnose it in pigs? We do it here at the Tifton Laboratory, which is our state veterinary diagnostic lab, with the plate test, the VAPA test, the card test, or FPA, which is the fluorescent polarization assay. Once those are positive, then in domestic pigs, it's sent on for confirmatory testing at the National Veterinary Services Laboratory, where they do complement fixation and FPA as well. So just looking at Georgia numbers, because I've worked here for the Department of Ag, but here in Georgia, we've tested 6,000 in a 2-year time period, September 20 to September 2022. 6,409 VAPA tests. Of those, 54 were positive. And when sent on to NVSL, 7 of those came back positive. And so that's 7 domestic backyard transitional herds that were then depopulated and quarantined. If they elected to only depopulate the infected, then the herd needed to go through a series of retesting to prove that they didn't have it, and multiple testing after 6 months. So the 9 confirmed by Tifton, if anybody's confused there are some facilities throughout the state, not very many, but that have a licensed captive feral swine population. Since they are feral swine, they don't go on to NVSL. They're confirmed with FPA at our Tifton laboratory, and 9 of those were positive and depopulated. Looking at pseudorabies from the Tifton lab, Tifton is also a Nolan lab. We're fortunate enough in the state of Georgia to have 3 Nolan labs. One of them is specifically focused on poultry. The other 2 are through the University of Georgia at Tifton and then in Athens. So looking at pseudorabies testing done at Tifton, they ran about an equal number of blood tests for pseudorabies, 6,486. And 3 of those with the ELISA antibody test were positive and depopulated. What about dogs? Dogs get brucellosis. And so the most common form is brucellosis. We did 1,328 brucellosis tests between 2021 and 2022. So that's a year in this case for dogs at Tifton. And 9 of those were positive and depopulated. So unfortunately, this spills over into our domestic animals, and it's most often because of their interaction with feral swine. So talking a little bit, I'm only going to touch on it just briefly, pseudorabies. Pseudorabies is an infectious and contagious DNA herpes virus. It's not as hardy in the environment, but it causes high mortality and severe neurologic syndromes that are rabies-like in other species than pigs. So dogs, cats, cattle, sheep, goats are all susceptible to this. So often what you'll see is these other animals have an interaction with feral pigs and everybody dies. And so it's important not just for our pigs, but also for other animals to try to keep them separated from feral swine. Transmission is through breeding and direct contact. It can last a few days in a lagoon or feed, but it's not really one of those survivors. There isn't any treatment for pseudorabies either. Just as a reminder, I mean, our commercial swine herds are both free of brucellosis and pseudorabies. So in all 50 states. In 2003 was the last time there was a commercial herd that tested positive. It is maintained in the feral populations, and thus it increases the risk of reintroduction and trade implications. The more feral pigs that we have, and the more that the disease spreads within populations of feral pigs. Vaccination is possible for pseudorabies, but requires approval through the USDA and, of course, through the state animal health official. And so that's the diseases that I was planning to talk about tonight. Like I said, there's plenty more. We could have a week presentation on all the diseases that they carry. But I wanted to touch on biosecurity because it's so important. We recognize that in Georgia, eradication is not possible. In other parts of the United States, potentially it could be if feral swine are briefly introduced there and quickly eliminated. But here, it's all about biosecurity. And in most of the southeastern United States, that is the message that we push out. Biocontainment, as a reminder, is the way of keeping the bad stuff in, like a BSL lab. Biosecurity is keeping that stuff out. So we recognize that feral swine have been present for 500 years, and despite our best efforts to eliminate them, they're going to persist. We can manage them by implementing stringent biosecurity. Transitional backyard operations, to be honest, those are the biggest risk because they have the less money to put up barriers, to invest in biosecurity, and so it becomes important for those transitional and backyard producers to do what they can for biosecurity. Biosecurity, I think of it like taking vitamins. I mean, it prevents the worst, but often it's forgotten or overlooked. So it needs to remain in place at all times, and it can be inconvenient and costly. And I'm going to talk about some biosecurity possibilities for different producers here on the next slide. One of the important things is to establish a barrier. So good fencing makes good neighbors, but good fencing also will keep feral swine out, but it's got to be a good fence. I've seen fences that are made of barbed wire that is lying on the ground, or bed springs and pallets, mattresses and things like that. That's not going to cut it. The feral swine are hardy. They can jump, they can dig. So it needs to be a good fence. And we'll go through some fencing recommendations. Establish a means of removal. So once the feral swine are documented, we got a problem, they're here, we see them on our cameras, trap them and trap the whole sounder. Don't just go out there and shoot them, but trap them and then eliminate them. Wearing protective clothing and practicing good personal hygiene when you do eliminate them is also important, and communicating that message to the employees that you work with. And then properly disposing of the carcass, because remember, for some diseases, it maintains itself in the blood and in the tissues for a prolonged period of time. So disposing of that carcass becomes very important. and then cooking the meat properly. Those are a few. I mean, we can get into a whole lot more depth on biosecurity, and Dr. Bickett Wendell could talk to you for hours and hours about biosecurity, and I think it's all good stuff. But I just wanted to touch on it a little bit more. From the Department of Public Health: avoid contact with visibly ill animals, practice safe field dressing techniques. Remember, clean, sharp knives. It's those dull knives that cause problems. When you can't cut through something and it slips and cuts you, that's when it becomes an issue for disease. After butchering, burn or bury the gloves or the parts of the carcass that isn't going to be eaten. Don't feed the dogs the raw meat, which is, kind of a fun thing to do, right? But it's not going to be good for the spread of brucellosis or other diseases. And then make sure to clean and disinfect all of the tools or instruments if you're a veterinarian out working with a herd that's possibly got some intermingling. Make sure to clean all your instruments thoroughly. This is just a reminder that feral hog transport, at least in the state of Georgia, is illegal. So transporting a live hog is something you do not want to do here. DNR is looking for you. And although it happens, it's illegal. I can't speak for every state. I don't know what their specific rules or laws are, but you would probably want to look and see what the rules are as far as feral hogs. There isn't any permit to transport a dead hog in the state. So I want to talk about how do we trap these things? How do we control feral pigs? The best way is trapping. It's not sending a bunch of hunters out into the woods. They've shown in Europe, in fact, that during the ASF outbreak, sending hunters in to eliminate populations only dispersed them. The trap should start over here on the right with a baiting, usually some sorted corn. Deer won't go for that, but the pigs will. And you bring in the pigs over a series of days or even a couple weeks until monitoring with the hunting cameras or the trail cameras that you got the whole sounder, because you need everybody. Remember, back from that effective and efficient breeding slide, that one sow escaping, this whole group can be back there within a year. So baiting the whole group, trapping the whole family group is important. Slowly, you condition them to the presence of the trap. So the trap is set up then over in this particular trap over their heads. They have no problem walking underneath it. And then once you know that they're comfortable with that, you press the button on your phone and shut the trap door, and you got everybody and can go and then humanely euthanize all these guys. The trap needs to be big enough. So there's a few things here to don't do. And I don't want to mention bad things about any one company, but just going to Tractor Supply or some other places, you can pick up traps like this and catch one pig, and great, oh yay, I've caught a pig. And you think, well, now I've eliminated the problem, but you have only educated the problem. They are smart. They're not going to come back to a trap that looks remotely like that. They're not going to come back to the same area. So you've just made the problem worse. So don't do that. Don't use one of these small box traps. Don't use a square trap, because pigs create pig ladders. They run right to the corner. They pile up in the corner, they climb up each other, and then hop over the top. So some things to remember about a good trap is a round shape. It needs to be large enough to get the whole grouping, and it needs to have at least 60 inches of height, because those suckers jump. And I've seen pictures of it. They can clear that if it's less than 60 inches. You'll also notice here too that the grid on these panels, on these hog panels, is graduated. So it's very small down at the bottom, because piglets are small and they can get through some of these hog panels. So it needs to be a very small size at the bottom. It can be bigger at the top, graduated up. Also, pigs don't like something on the ground. So if they have to step over something, they're going to shy away from it. It's going to take them a long time to step over it, just like any pig. So you want to bury that threshold if they're going through a door. Another couple things not to do: those those saloon style doors that open up and then close. Well, when a big fat pig walks through that, then two little small pigs run out. So the saloon style is not recommended either. There's different traps out there on the market. I haven't explored all of them. There's some people that say the net type traps, the new version of those is working well. But I do know from talking with wildlife services that they use this round trap, and that's what our conservation districts use as well. Shooting. So notice that I didn't say hunting. Shooting. Hunting has a financial incentive and can create a problem, but shooting, we're not going to stop any guy from or gal from shooting pigs that are rooting through a crop that has recently been planted and thousands of dollars that have been put in the ground. So shooting to eliminate the threat of the threat right then is recommended, but just knowing that you're probably not going to eliminate the problem, you're just kind of controlling it for a given time. Aerial operations happen. They're very effective, but they need to be occur at the right time when there's not a lot of vegetation. In Georgia, we have a lot of vegetation, so it takes doing it during winter months, and also it requires a large area. You can't just be an individual farmer to pay for this thing. It's expensive, so it would take a cooperative effort between a group of farmers or an entity like a state agency, something like that. And I don't have the slide for it, but poison is another option that might be on the table in a few years. It's not here yet, but the trick is getting a poison that is lethal and for pigs, not native wildlife. And so I don't want everybody to go out and research what kind of poison to use. There's not really anything available at the moment. But since 2013, the NWRC in Fort Collins, Colorado, has been working on a bait poison that uses microencapsulated sodium nitrite. That's nothing more than a meat preservative, believe it or not, for bacon. But that is, at low levels, can be toxic to pigs because they're lacking an enzyme, a reductase enzyme that can revert the methahemoglobinemia that results from eating the nitrite. They've seen some good promise with this poison, 95% mortality rate in the feral swine trials, but it is going to take some time for it to get through the EPA and then through environmental tests, as well as the local governments need to approve this. And when it is approved, it's probably only going to be used in certain areas on a limited basis. And even then, we've had rat poison forever, but we still have rats. So it's not going to be the end-all be-all solution, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. And that's it. That's the presentation. I just have a special thanks and shout out to Dr. Menchek with the University of Georgia, for Matt Ovenchek with the USDA Wildlife Services, for Dr. Cobb, who's the former state vet of Georgia. Dr. Hannibal is our current state vet. He gave this presentation as well. And then for our Tifton laboratory with their numbers. Also the sources that I use, Dr. Booker, and the USDA APHIS's, I got a little typo there, swine health team. So thank you, everyone. And I'd be happy to answer some questions if you have any.
Yeah, I've got a couple in the chat. So we'll go with the first question. And I'm going to allow Dr. Gay Miller to talk. Dr. Miller, can you pose your question that you typed into the chat?
Sure. I think I can anyway.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So basically, I'm interested in you giving some information about home range of feral swine, and in particular, the potential risk that feral swine could pose to the domestic swine population in the U.S., given the breadth of their home range. If it would be more likely that they're going to have only a local transmission risk, or if home range is big enough that we need to be paying really close attention there. Thank you.
Yeah, so the information that I got on home range was from Dr. Ryan Booker's presentation, which you can get from folks at the swine health, the USDA swine health group. I think they have a link, or through the SHIP program, the swine health improvement program. They have a copy of that presentation. Great presentation from Dr. Booker, but he talks about the home range of a boar and the potential spread of ASF with regard to the home range. I don't want to misquote him, so I don't know the specific number, but it's over 10 miles that these guys travel. And yeah, I think we need to consider that. Let's say that through our surveillance efforts, we find ASF in a boar. Well, we need to consider what the control area size is going to be for this depopulation and surveillance effort that happens after the detection. And there'll be a 72-hour a standstill, according to the Red Book. So that standstill is going to give us a little bit of time to try to figure out what this control area is going to look like. But in feral pigs, I mean, we need to make that thing a pretty big control area, and not just that standard, 7 kilometers or 10 kilometers. I can't remember what it is. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Got another question in the chat, and I'm going to activate Dr. Heidi Kassenberg's microphone. Dr. Kassenberg.
All right, thanks for a lot of great information. I've got a question about biosecurity. It seems like a lot of the biosecurity measures are pretty straightforward, but kind of adoption and maintenance by producers may be is obviously a larger problem. Do you know of any work that's being done or has been done on sort of behavioral aspects of producers to uptake and adopt biosecurity measures?
I don't specifically know of any that have looked at the, behavior of the producers themselves. But I know, I know
aspects of them, whatever attributes, I guess, it's not just behavior, I guess, would be likely to have them have uptake, I guess. Yeah.
I know as a producer myself, I'm trying to find those things that take minimal time and effort, but maximum results. And, I'm a cattle producer, but I'm looking at things like, how can I screen people that come onto my farm? Have they traveled internationally? Specifically, have they traveled to Africa? I think that people need to really consider that. And that's a simple thing. All they have to do is ask the person who wants to go on their farm where they've been. And it's a conversation rather than a big fencing effort. I think for a commercial producer, it's a different story. They need to invest, financially, significantly to protect the commercial herd, both for them and for the rest of the United States. But, in these open air curtain kind of fencing situations, I think they need to invest in a fence. And that may be a hard thing to chew on for a lot of producers.
Okay, great. Two great questions. I have one final question. If you're aware of the average cost of the large round traps that you recommend.
So they're expensive. I don't have the latest, especially with all the inflation we've been dealing with. But they're not just $3,000 or $5,000. I think they're over $10,000 for the ones that are automatically released and that are set, basically on wheel rollers to drop. If you talk to U.S. Wildlife Services, they have some specific information about traps. But what I would recommend is work, especially if you're in the southeastern U.S., working with the conservation districts who have purchased traps that you can use for free. So there are options out there. If not, if that's not an available option, then Wildlife Services does come out and trap for you. They're a small team, but they do have a little bit of funding that allows them to do that. Otherwise, you may want to consider going in as a group or a cooperative or working with a farm co-op to purchase one for a group of people. It doesn't have to be one of those prefabricated traps. As long as you stick to those guidelines that I mentioned, people have successfully built their own. So just take into consideration pig behavior and the parameters that we talked about, that 5 feet minimum height, that graduated, small to wider paneling, and the threshold. People have made their own with just a remote camera.
Great. Looking at the chat, Dr. Weaver, your presentation was very well received. A lot of comments, thanks, and for a very great presentation. So with that, we'll close out. Again, Dr. Weaver, fantastic presentation. We thank you very much for supporting our webinar program, and I will wish everyone a great afternoon or evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.